Um, so for the next activity, I'd be thinking if you were asked to talk about your hometown and talk about it for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, here are some of the things you could talk about. Now, I thought for this one, since I've already talked a lot about Sydney, I might describe Weihai, because I know Weihai, I know Beijing, I know Weihai, I know Changchun a little bit, and of course Sydney and Newcastle in Australia. But I thought Weihai is kind of my second home, so I would talk about that. Now, in Weihai, there's this beautiful art sculpture, and with a little bit of photoshopping, you can take a photo of yourself and have it looking like you're a giant person in a photograph. As you can see, I'm not very good at Photoshop. You can actually see the line down there that I've copied and repeated that. You can see the post 1, 2, 3, 4. They're not actually that close together. Anyway, so I thought what we'll do is I'll imagine that I'm from Weihai so that we can work through this one together. So you might talk about your hometown and say where your hometown is. We've already done that a little bit. So Weihai is in the east of, or the northeast of Shandong province. So I know in Chinese you say east-north. In English we say northeast. So the northeast of Shandong province. It's across the sea from South Korea. It's a few hours drive northeast from Qingdao. So there's a different kind of ways you might describe it. Also, it's a seaside town. It's a coastal town. It's by the sea. It's near the mountains, you could say. There are some mountains in Weihai as well. So talk about that. So, or if you were doing this as a speech, you would start with a formal introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about my hometown and to describe my hometown to you. First of all, let me talk about the location of my hometown. And we would say that. So if you were giving a speech, it would be good to have a nice formal introduction. You might talk about the population. The population of Weihai, last time I checked, was around 11 million people in the city of Weihai, but actually more like 4 or 5 million people if you include the areas around it, including Rongcheng and Wendang. But they're actually towns that are part of the government area of Weihai, not the city of Weihai. If you're from Weihai and you're watching this, by the way, I've had some confusion there. The city of Weihai is not including Wendang, Rongcheng, Rushan. That's the municipality, the area that the Weihai government manages that area. But you leave a city, travel through the countryside, get to another town. So the city of Weihai versus the municipality of Weihai. What's the transport like there? So if I was talking about the transport in Weihai, I would say that the transport is actually very basic. There's buses, taxis, or your own vehicles, whether you drive or ride a bike. Now, the good thing is recently a high-speed railway line was connected to Weihai. I think only 2 years ago that was finished. So that's good. So now you can get from Beijing to Weihai in 6 or 7 hours, but before that used to take 17 hours. However, around the city, generally, you might take a lot of taxis. You might order an Uber, although you would say Didi in Weihai. And yeah, more and more people are starting to drive. When I first moved to Weihai, there wasn't a lot of traffic. Probably only 10% of families had a car. And that was like 6 or 7 years ago. But now I'd say almost half of the families in Weihai now have a car. It's gotten a lot busier. Entertainment. So what can we do in my hometown? Now, I've talked about Australia, and I know that in Weihai there is also a lot of outdoor activities, which is why I chose Weihai to live. We have beautiful beaches, of course. The International Beach in the northwest of Weihai, near where I live, has some beautiful golden sand with a lot of seaside activities, swimming, boating, fishing, beach volleyball, and those kind of things you can do. And of course, that means you can also go out and eat seafood. There are also some mountains in Weihai, so you can go hiking, and I often do that with my friends. In terms of more exciting entertainment, there is one really good shopping mall, but only the one. You've got a nice Koreatown. There's a lot of nice Korean restaurants and shops in the southeast of Weihai. And there are, of course, places to go watch movies and sing karaoke at a KTV bar. But otherwise, there's not a huge amount of a range of entertainment. If you don't like outdoor activities like me, if you don't like going out and doing things, you might find Weihai a little bit boring. Luckily, I love the outdoors, so Weihai is perfect for me. Employment. Now, I'd say that the most common jobs in Weihai revolve around three areas. In summer, there is a large tourist industry, but that is just during the months of like June, July, August, and part of September. The rest of the year, there's a lot of import and export companies, particularly sending clothing to and from Korea, but also other countries. I actually have a cousin in Australia. She works in a clothing company, and she says that they get some of their clothing from a factory in Weihai. She told me how it was quite interesting to know. So a lot of clothing factories and seafood, like dried seafood is caught and made or dried in and around Weihai. So, and shipping, so sending things in and out of China through Weihai. So a lot of people work in these areas. Facilities in terms of schools and hospitals, Weihai has a pretty good reputation. It has Shandong University and Hagongda, Harbin Institute of Technology. So a couple of good universities, lots of good schools. A lot of rich people from Beijing will send their families to live and their children to study in Weihai because of the nice environment. And so because of that, the schools have a pretty good reputation. And I think the hospitals aren't too bad, although they could certainly be less crowded and a little bit cleaner. Food, of course, Weihai is famous for seafood. Not so much famous. In fact, the Weihai seafood is better than Shanghai or Qingdao seafood, but just that from within the area, people go to Weihai to eat seafood. Shandong in general is also famous for the jianbing, the famous kind of Chinese fast food that you get on the street, the wrap, where you get the thin pancake and they fold it over and you eat it. It's a nice street food, one of my favorite street foods. And the Shandong area is kind of where this is from, not from Weihai, but the area in Shandong is famous for this. So these are the kind of things you could talk about if you were asked to describe your hometown. And now I just talked about that for about 4 minutes there, or 5 minutes. So if I can talk actually for more than 5 minutes, you should be able to talk about your hometown for at least 2 or 3 minutes. Now, we've got a lot of time for our deeper discussion today. So let's have a think about towns in general versus cities and things like this. How are most towns changing these days? Well, in a country like China, all the bigger cities are developing the transport and connecting high-speed railways, and more cities. Like I know that Harbin just opened up their subway system like 1 or 2 years ago, which is great because Harbin was a terrible city for transport before they did that. So in a lot of countries, they're developing better transport. Of course, in Australia, the cities are getting taller. You know, for a long time, Australia was a very flat country. People lived in houses, but now more and more people are building apartments and living in apartments. Hornsby, the town or the suburb of Sydney, where I grew up, it's a place that used to have just a few apartment buildings. Now there's 30 or 40 large, tall apartment buildings in that area that were not there, or probably more than that, actually. It's basically now that half the people in Hornsby live in apartments. So now in a city like Sydney, half the people or more live in apartments compared to houses. Newcastle, where I am, it's still mostly houses, but that will probably change in the next 20 years as well. How is living in the city different to living in the countryside? Well, of course, the first thing is, you know, in the countryside, people definitely live in houses and they might have a lot more space around their house. Although this is true in most countries, but not so much in China. In China, if you go to the countryside farming villages, they actually keep all their homes quite close together, so they have more farming land. But in Australia, you'll have one home and they'll have a big farm around that person's house. They'll have like a house and a big clear yard, and then around that will be the farming. So China kind of works more together to have more land because of the high population. Of course, living in the city, there is more pollution, more crowds, more traffic, and can be a little bit more stressful, more noisy. It's not as healthy for the breathing the air. But there's more entertainment. There's movies, there's nightclubs, there's concerts, there's sporting events, international festivals. But in the countryside, well, there's clean air, not many people, lots of space. It's much quieter, it's peaceful, but there won't be so much to do. It'll be much, much, much quieter lifestyle. Where do most people live in China? Well, think about this question 30 or 40 years ago, and you'd say most people lived in the countryside. If you ask that question now, you probably have to say most people live in the city. I don't know the exact numbers in China. I think in Australia, it's something like 80% of people or 90% of people live in towns and cities, and only like 10 or 20% live in the countryside. I'm not sure about that number, though. But most people in Australia live in the cities. And I'm pretty sure most people in China now live in the cities. You look at Beijing has like 23 million. Shanghai has about the same. I don't know which is more these days, but Shanghai and Beijing are fighting each other. 22 million, 24, 25, going up all the time with the number of people living there. I think China has something like 120 cities with more than 1 million people. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. Australia has like 5 cities with more than 1 million people. So why are so many people moving to the cities? That comes back to here, but also opportunities. In the countryside, working the farms is hard. You don't make a lot of money, and there's not a lot to do. Young people especially get bored. Their parents have worked the farm. They grow up on their phones looking at social media going, wow, the cities look so exciting. Mum, I'm leaving. And they leave their parents once they're 18 or 21, and they go and find work in the city. So, of course, there's many obvious reasons for this, but that also leads to some problems. First of all, it means we have more crowds and more pollution in the city, which means the environment is not as good. It also means we don't have enough people working the farms, which means, which kind of has an imbalance. It means the farmers are out there working hard, very difficult life, and not earning a lot of money. They're not developing those areas. They're staying poor because they don't have people there to set up other businesses and do other kinds of work to support the farmers. The other thing you hear about is the migrant workers, parents that go into the city but leave their children behind in the villages. Now, personally, I think this is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. I think a child needs nothing more than their parents. Parents need to be there for their children. I can understand taking your children with you. I can understand one parent going into the city to work 11 months of the year or 10 months of the year and spending a couple of months back. But you hear stories about people that just go back for 1 week during the Spring Festival, and that's the only time they see their children. I think that's a terrible thing for those children. So how can we stop this happening? How can we stop so many people going from the countryside into the large cities? And like I said earlier, we need to develop those country towns. They need to have good quality schools with good resources. If the schools are good, parents will be much more willing to stay there. Then they need to set up some basic infrastructure. The farmers need to make more money. We'll look after the farmers and give them a better life. There needs to be, good hospitals as well. Schools, hospitals, and money. If they have those 3 things, they will be better off. So I think if people can afford a nice home to live, there's a good hospital to send their family to if somebody is sick, and their children are getting a good education, then people will be quite happy to stay in the countryside. And even though they don't have as much money, the cost has to be reasonably balanced. If they can still have a good life in the countryside, then they might stay. And here's the thing, in Australia, people want to leave the cities to go to the countryside if they have the money to buy a nice bit of land and build a nice house and have a huge place for their children to run around and play and maybe have some animals to raise. We want to. That's like a dream if you can. Not too far from the cities, but if you can live an hour and a half drive from this Sydney, that's nice. Those properties are still very expensive, and a lot of people want to do that. Okay, guys, that is the last pre-prepared video. So I would love to hear your suggestions. What should I talk about in video 10? So please scan the QR code on Weixin or call us in Weihai. Thank you very much for being patient and listening to me throughout all of these videos, and I look forward to hearing your suggestions. Bye-bye.